Yeah. Thanks for coming. It's a good day. House.
Yeah.
A little city up there by the college. Blacksmith, Zoom is working. That's part of the 1904. What's their exhibit? Oh.
You know Linda and Aaron? They was. Eric.
Oh. Yeah. This. Wait, oh. Is it? Did I turn it on? It's on. Should. I think they fixed some things about Zoom that make it work better.
Thank you.
They fixed some things about Zoom that make it work better. Hello.
Good evening, and welcome to our first Oscar Williams lecture of 2025, a visit to the 1904 World's Fair. Our guest speaker hails from all the way from Missouri, across the bridge and And he works with the Historical Society, Missouri Historical Society, and he's been there with them for 29 years. Right now, as library research manager. So we learned that the field over there and thought was so fun about that. Anyway, without further ado, I've been researching and I'm very excited about all the things I'm learning. But I want to go right to Jason Stratman. Let's have a warm welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Yes, my name is Jason Stratman. I work at the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis. I am the library outreach manager, which means I help people doing research on St. Louis and Missouri history. And I also go out into the community and talk to them about a wide range of topics, including the 1904 World Fair. So that's why I'm here tonight to talk to you about the fair. Through the years, I've been working at the Historical Society. A lot of people have come in asking for information about the 1904 World Fair. And I've been able to do a lot of different research about it through the years. I found out a lot of interesting stories and a lot of fun things about the fair. So my boss said I needed to put together some sort of presentation to share all that information with people. So that was my job 7 years ago, to put together a presentation about the 1904 World Fair. And so I've been doing this job for about 28 and a half, almost 29 years. So that is true, yes. If in case you're wondering, I started when I was 5. I was right out of kindergarten. I was a child protege and went right into that job. Okay, so that's not completely true. I'm sorry, that's a lie. I was actually 6, but it's all good. So I graduated out of college and started working at the Historical Society and have been there ever since that time. And so it's been a good job. Has taught me a lot of different things about St. Louis and Missouri history. And ultimately, it helped me also find my beautiful wonderful wife as well. So she worked there, and we've been working there for almost 29 years and been married for 26 years. Worked out really money. So let's talk a little bit about the 1904 World's Fair. So I start off with this interesting quote that I found in a guidebook that describes was describing the World's Fair. It says, in order to really understand and appreciate the many interests and beauties of the World's Fair, one must spend the entire summer in St. Louis. Now, I do not have the entire summer to talk about the fair tonight, unfortunately. So I will condense it down to about an hour's worth of time and share with you some of the stories that I find to be most interesting, the most fun, the most cool. But this does not mean that I'm going to talk about everything that you are interested about the fair. There may be something that I'm going to talk about that you have never heard of before, which is my goal. There may be some things that you want to hear about that I'm not going to talk about at all. I do apologize in advance for that. But there is no real way for me to talk about the entire aspect of the fair in just one presentation. There's so much to know about the fair, so much to understand and to study, that the things I talk about in this presentation can be individually brought out and put into its own presentation. So I may skip over a few things, but I will have some time at the very end if you have any questions about what I've been talking about tonight. So my objective is, using materials found in the Missouri Historical Society collections, I will provide an overview of the 1904 World's Fair, including quotes, newspaper headlines, and tidbits of information that you can use to impress your friends and family. So in case you haven't figured it out already, I like to have fun with this presentation. So don't take it too seriously. Don't take it too be willing to laugh along with me as I give this presentation, even if it's have my silly kind of jokes as I go along. So there you go. Okay. So my job now is to talk about the 1903 World's Fair. And yes, I did say the 1903 World's Fair. Originally, that's how it was scheduled to be. It was meant to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the greatest land transaction that had ever taken place at that time, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. It was scheduled to be in St. Louis in 1903, and groundbreaking and all of that took place in 1901. We see in this photograph here, we see David R. Francis, the gentleman that is holding the pitchfork there. He's getting ready to do the proverbial digging of the dirt and getting ready to throw it over his backside. He's the president of the World's Fair company that is putting on the fair. And if you look a little closer to the next picture, this is a photograph of that actual shovel that the Missouri Historical Society has in its collection. After the fair was over with, many of the materials that was from the fair that were used for the fair came into the collections of the Missouri Historical Society. And I will be sharing a few of those as we go over tonight. Now, ultimately, the 1903 World's Fair had to be postponed until 1904. Construction was going very, very slowly. It was very slowly to get organized, and many of the buildings were not being built in a timely fashion. And so the different governments from around the world who were in charge of putting on these buildings and such, pleaded with the St. Louis organizers to put back the fair by one entire year. And so ultimately, that was what was decided. They decided that in order to have the biggest and best fair possible, that they needed to delay it by one entire year. So the 1903 World's Fair became known then as the 1904 World's Fair. But yet, with the name Louisiana Purchase Exposition still hold as an appropriate name for the fair. Ultimately, yes, the Louisiana Purchase did take place in 1803, but the actual land transfer to the United States did not occur until 1804 in St. Louis. And so ultimately, yes, that name still was able to be used for the fair the way it was properly known. So let's look a little bit about 1904 in review. Some of the things that were going on in the world at that time, Japan and Russia were engaged in what was known as World War Zero. This was a big war that was fought between between the Japanese and the Russians over control of the area of Japan, Korea, China. They were fighting over who was ultimately going to take over and take that land into its possession. The Japanese ultimately wins that war, and Russia is declared the loser. And many people say that what was going on in this war was the same things that were going on at the time of World War I. So military historians call this war, instead of the Japanese-Russian war, they call it World War Zero, as a way to kind of give it the same substance as World War I would have been at that time. Also, in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt is elected president. He already had been president at that time. He became president when McKinley was assassinated in 1901. But in 1904, this was the first election that he actually had won to become president. Now, in 1904, St. Louis City itself was the fourth largest city in the country with a population of just under 600,000 people. This is just in the city of St. Louis itself. This is not St. Louis, what we call the St. Louis metropolitan area of today, just the city of St. Louis itself. And I find myself to be a numbers guy. I like looking at numbers and statistics. And I found in one of our books in the library collection that they described St. Louis in this way in 1904. 11 public gymnasiums, 20 public parks, 31 breweries, 42 singing societies, 124 hotels, 136 labor unions, 481 bakeries, 727 butcher shops, 893 barber shops, 1,242 dressmaking shops, and 1,615 saloons. Now, this is just in the city of St. Louis itself. And I always tell people that in 1904, St. Louis did have its priorities when it comes to the things that it was building in the city of St. Louis. Now, specifically on this date in 1904, January the 30th, a man by the name of George Schmidt is crowned the boxing champion of the world. He's probably not really well known in most people's world today, but he also was very heavily into weightlifting, and he kind of helped establish the whole weightlifting genre of the time period. And so if you look at him, he looks like he's been lifting some weights. And he won the boxing championship on that day. Also, in the local St. Louis headlines in the newspaper, they were looking to construct a railroad station for the fairgrounds that would ultimately become known as the Wabash Railroad Depot. This building is there still today in St. Louis. They did build it for the fair. It currently is vacant. It doesn't have a current use, but hopefully sometime in the future it will be resurrected into a new life. There on the bottom of the page, we have the Weather Bird. The Weather Bird is a comic strip that is included in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It's been coming in every day of the Post-Dispatch since 1901. It is the oldest continuous running cartoon of any newspaper in the United States. The Weather Bird is known for giving the weather forecast and some sort of local tidbit of information about St. Louis. So on this date, in January 30th in 1904, the whole entire country had just gotten over a big blizzard. There was snowstorms all across the country, and they were concerned that the snowstorm was so severe in St. Louis that it was causing construction delays for the fair. And they were not sure if they were going to be ready in time for opening day on April the 30th. And now let's turn our attention a little bit to the fair itself. These are a couple quotes that we have in our collections at the Historical Society from a gentleman by the name of Edward Schneiderhan. Edward Schneiderhan was a local St. Louisan. He was of German descent. His parents came from Germany, settled in St. Louis. Schneiderhan worked as a lawyer for the St. Louis Archdiocese. So he was very much into all things German, all things politics, and all things Catholic. So if you were going to an event in St. Louis around this time period, and it happened to be German, Catholic, and political, he was at these kind of events. What's really interesting about Mr. Schneiderhan is that he kept a diary of his life. And so from the 1890s to the 19-teens, we have these journals in our collections at the Historical Society where he documents things that he's doing day by day, places that he's going to, things that he's seeing. And he went to the 1904 World's Fair on many occasions. And he writes down in great detail about his visits to the fair. And so these are a couple quotes that we found from those journals. It says, "The picture of the fair was a revelation, beauty indescribable. The multiplicity of beautiful views was astonishing. It was scarcely believable that any beholder could see these unforgettable, beautiful scenes without the deepest emotions." So he wrote very eloquently and very openly about his time going to the fair, and he was very much moved by what he was seeing while at the fair. Some days he would go to the fair and he would have paragraph upon paragraph of what he did at the fair, what building he went to, how he would describe the exhibits. And other days he would just say, "Yeah, went to the fair today," which is very surprising for me because since he is of German descent, very heavily into German things, he went to the fair on German Day. And I was expecting this very long, detailed description of what he did, because I was going to be presenting the same presentation to a German club in St. Charles County. So I was hoping to impress them with great German stuff. Unfortunately, he writes, "Went to fair for Germany." That's all. Nothing more, nothing less. It's like, I was hoping to get some great details about Germany, but he did not include that in his diary. So, the map that I gave you tonight when you came in is a map of the fairgrounds. This kind of will show you where most of the buildings are located on the fairgrounds. The fair itself covered over 1,240 acres of land. So it was meant to be one of the biggest and best World's Fair possible. So since St. Louis had the 1903/1904 World's Fair, his job was to compete with the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. And so they wanted to be bigger and better than Chicago. Now, Chicago only had about 600 acres of land for their fair. So St. Louis thought they should be able to be bigger and better than that. So they decided they wanted to have as much possible land as they could. So that's why it was over 1,200 acres. St. Louis to Chicago rivalry dates back to the 1860s and 70s, going all the way up to into today. And so St. Louis was very much set on making their fair bigger and better than Chicago fair. And in my opinion, it probably was bigger and better. So the fair itself ran from April 30th through December 1st of 1904. There were 12 different palaces, which included the U.S. government building. There were also 21 foreign buildings that were on the fairgrounds. So these were buildings that were put together by the various different countries of the world. 43 state and territorial buildings, So these were buildings that were done by the US states and territories at that time. There were more than 50 different attractions on the pike itself. And the pike was more like the amusement park aspect of the fair. And there were also several other different attractions that you could go on throughout the fairgrounds itself. And these were places that were not specific to one area of the fair itself. So if you came to St. Louis looking for a place to stay for the fair, there are many different options available to you. You could choose from 133 different hotels, more than 1,000 rooming houses, more than 500 different boarding houses, and then they also had 10 different public halls. Where basically it was like a gymnasium. You go in, you pay like a little fee, and you just sleep on the floor of the gymnasium. The advertisements that you see there on the right on the top are for various different hotels that were advertising for people to come and stay at their hotel. Interesting fact about this is that many of the hotels that were being built in St. Louis at the time period were built exclusively just for the fair itself. They were meant to be a temporary structure that came from the fair, and once the fair was over, they were going to be torn down. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as it relates to some of the other buildings on the fairground in a little bit as well. But if you were a little bit on the thrifty side, you could rent out a basement or a second floor of your house and rent it to people who are coming into town for the fair. So the advertisements there on the bottom are for private homes where people would offer up their room or their entire house at a time for people coming to rent them out. There's a story that we have, an oral history that was done from a gentleman whose family did exactly that. They rented out their entire house. They actually moved into a local hotel, stayed at the hotel, and they had foreign dignitaries and such coming and staying at their house on Washington Avenue in St. Louis. And I suppose they felt like they could make enough money by doing that it was worthwhile doing for them. Let me back up for just 1 second. The photograph that we see here is for the inside in. And what's fun about this hotel, it was on the fairgrounds itself. It was inside the fairgrounds. So therefore, that is why it was called the inside in. Now, you could stay at this hotel, but it probably would not have very good rating on TripAdvisor, because what I'm told is that many of the walls for the individual rooms were made out of burlap sack and these very thin paper type of materials, and so no privacy, everybody can hear what's going on, so you may or may not want to stay at this hotel. You may want to consider taking more of a higher ranked one than that. Now, if you were visiting the fair, if you were coming from the Illinois side into St. Louis, the bluff line of the railroad that was coming out of Alton had just announced that they were going to be extending their opportunities to come to the fair by adding another train to come. The additional train was going to be coming in that night and in the daytime, so that more people from the Illinois side coming into St. Louis would have an option to travel to St. Louis. They were also, I find these newspaper reports that they were wanting to make sure that they had the fastest route possible from Alton into St. Louis or from other parts of Illinois to make sure that the visitors could get there and not miss any of the action of what was going on at the fair as well. This is another little article I found. The gentleman by the name of Leo Waldemeyer, who I'm assuming lived in the area, was recovering from a disability of paralysis, but he had visited the fair for several days in August of 1904. And this was an article that I found in the Alton Evening Telegraph newspaper. Now, if you wanted to visit the fair, you would need to get a ticket in order to get into the fair. And they had adult tickets for 50 cents and a child ticket would cost you 25 cents. And so if you equivalent that out to 2025 money, that's almost $18 a ticket just to get into the fairgrounds itself if you were an adult, and almost $9 for a child. So this got you onto the fairgrounds. It allowed you to see many of the different buildings, but there were some different attractions that you had to pay an additional admission fee to get into, like the Jerusalem Village, and many of the attractions that were on the pike were also on an individual fee basis. Could be 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents, depending on what it was. There were certain days where you could get in at a discounted price, but Just know that this ticket price got you in the door, so to speak, it got you through the turnstiles, but that's about it. Now, if you went to the fair and you were a worker at the fair, you had what was called a worker's pass. And that worker's pass allowed you to get into the fairgrounds at no cost. This was basically your free pass to get into the fairgrounds. But you could also buy what was called a stockholder's pass. And a stockholder pass was kind of like a season ticket type of thing, where you buy so many tickets in advance at a discounted price. And the only difference with this is that it was not transferable to anybody. You had to get your picture taken, you had to sign the bottom of the ticket thing to verify that that was in fact you who was using that ticket. Does anybody recognize that young gentleman on the left there? I'm gonna blow up his picture for you so you can actually see it a little bit better. His name is Thomas S. Elliott, also known as Thomas Stearns Elliott, also known as T.S. Eliot, the great American writer. The Elliott family is from St. Louis. The grandfather is the founder of Washington University. The father here on the right is a well-known businessman in St. Louis at that time. And young Elliott is a high school student at the time. And as you can see from his ticket stub, he only had one left. His father never actually went to the fair, so he bought his pass just to have it, I guess. But these are things that we have in the collection at the Missouri Historical Society in our archives department. Now, this was a question that I typically give. What was the total attendance for the fair? So you all already know a little bit about this, I would assume. 19 million was the answer that was given, and that is almost correct. The actual official attendance was 19,694,855. Now, a couple minutes ago, I was talking about the workers' pass and the adult tickets and the children's tickets to get in. That would include the free admissions for all of the workers who were on the fairgrounds, as well as the paid admissions for the people who actually were visiting the fair. And so they decided that the people who are working the fair need to be included with the attendance for the fair as well. And so almost 7 million people were admitted free for working the fair, and almost 13 million were admitted for visiting the fair itself. And as you can see there are multitudes of people lining up in different streets and the avenues of the fair. And so if you can imagine 100,000, 200,000 people on the fairgrounds at one time, or over the course of the day, that would to me be very, very crowded. The date that had the highest attendance was September the 14th, and that was declared as St. Louis Day. So all of the schools were students were out of school, and all of St. Louis was invited to come to the fair. And so over 440,000 people were on the fairground in one particular day. To me, that seemed very claustrophobic. I don't know if I would want to be there on the day. I probably was going to go on a day that had a whole lot of people. That's how I feel about it. So some of the more well-known people to come to St. Louis for the fair. President Roosevelt came to St. Louis after he actually won the election. He kind of stayed away. I guess maybe as a political move that he didn't want to kind of interfere with what was going on. But he visited the fair on November the 26th. It was a great large parade in his honor. And also in early May of 1904, the Chinese prince came to St. Louis to visit the fair. Prince Huan was actually the Chinese dignitary who was in charge of bringing all of the Chinese delegation to St. Louis for the fair. He was kind of overseeing the construction of the Chinese pavilion, bringing in all of the different items that were going to be exhibited at the fair. And so he is the crown prince. He was next in line to the throne of China. And there's a great story that I was able to find about his visit to the fair. When he arrived in St. Louis in May, crazy amounts of rain going on. Fair was not, it was going on, but you really couldn't visit the fair like you want to because of the amount of rain. So he was kind of held up in his suite at one of the downtown hotels. He had like the penthouse suite. He had like 3 or 4 different rooms all combined together for his entourage of people. And he's there in his suite. There's a guy in St. Louis called George Kunkel. You may or not know that name, but he was a well-known piano player in St. Louis. He did a lot of composing and music in St. Louis. And he also was a very well virtuoso of playing the piano. So what he does is he actually writes a piece of music in honor of the prince coming to the fair. Somehow Kunkel gets to the Chinese delegation, gives them the piece of sheet music and to deliver it to the prince. The prince gets the piece of music, is really taken that someone would actually write some music in his honor. So he invites Kunkel and Kunkel's wife to come to his suite to perform the music for him. Funny story is when he gets there to get ready to perform the music, they realize that the piano that is in his suite is actually a player piano. And it can't be played with normal playing of the piano. So they had to get the special instruments and the tools to disconfigure it so it can be played. Well, the prince tells the hotel staff to go get the materials to get to do it. Well, the hotel staff is taking way too long to get it taken care of, so the prince goes back into his private quarters, comes back out with his own set of tools. He drops down to the ground, starts working on the piano. He pulls Kunkel down to the floor with him. They work on it together. They come back up. The piano's all ready to go, and Kunkel is able to play the music for him.
Yeah, it's on.
So the prince is really impressed by this, and so he asks him to play more music, and more music, and more music. And then eventually the prince, well, then the Kunkel decides he wants to play for him some ragtime music. And ragtime music in 1904 was kind of a little on the risky side. It wasn't considered yet mainstream. They didn't really allow it on the fairgrounds proper at that time. So it was more delegated towards the pipe because that was where the CD stuff was going on. But Kunkel was playing ragtime music for the prince. The prince had never heard of ragtime before. And so he's trying to figure out what's this new music you're playing. And so Kunkel was explaining to him the history of ragtime and the whole backstory of what ragtime was about. And so what turned out to be was supposed to be a one song performance, ended up being like 3 hours worth of music that was being played by Kunkel. At the very end of the concert, the prince is speaking with Kunkel and offers him anything that he wants out of the entire suite to take with him as a thank you for his coming and performing. And Kunkel takes two very ornate old pieces of Chinese vases. And the backstory about this was a couple of years ago, I had a gentleman who was researching two vases that were found from the 1904 World's Fair that had been acquired by his aunt. And I was having a hard time coming up with anything. And I came across this article in the newspaper that talks about this Kunkel in his concert for Prince. And he has these vases. I'm thinking, I found it. This guy, was trying to figure out where these vases came from the fair. Well, bad story is that Kunkel got the vases that were Chinese vases. The guy who was looking for the vases that I was helping, they were Japanese vases. And so I found a wonderful story that does not help this other guy at all, but I still think it's a fascinating story. But still trying to figure out what happened to these vases. Kunkel was a really well-known music composer, musician in St. Louis. He lived in a very fancy, ornate house in the Central West End, neighborhood of St. Louis. Unfortunately, that house was torn down in the 1940s. My guess is that those vases may have been destroyed at the time of the house being torn down, but I don't know that for sure. So I would love to find out more about this story to find out what really happened to these vases. Now, if you came to the fair, and as I was mentioning, it was 1,200 acres, there was no way that you would be able to walk that amount of land in one day. So there was what was called the intramural railroad that was basically a on-off type of railroad where you could get on, you could pay your admission price of 10 cents. You could take stop 1, go to stop 2, get off, see the attractions around stop 2, get back on, go to stop 2, stop 3, stop 4, etc. It was a total of 17 different stops that had 15 miles worth of track. And that map that I gave you does show the railroad on there as well. So you can basically start at one end of the fairgrounds, work your way all the way around, and you can see as much as you can see within the course of one day. Quick interesting story about stop number 13. stop 13 is upper, on the upper corner, there's a lot of the mining gold areas where stop 13 was located at. And for some reason, the miners were very superstitious, and they didn't like being around stop number 13. So they were pleading with the fair organizers to change their stop from stop number 13 to stop number 12 and a half. They didn't want to be associated with 13, so they figured if they were stop number 12 and a half, it would be a whole lot better for them. Unfortunately, it was never actually changed, so they were stuck with stop number 13. If you went to the fair, there were many different buildings to go into to visit. One of those buildings would have been the Palace of Fine Arts. This was one of the only structures that was on the fairgrounds that was built as a permanent structure for the fair. At this time, the art museum for St. Louis was looking for a new home, so they decided to make the Palace of Fine Arts to be a permanent structure. So once the fair was over with, the fair people would be moving out, and the art museum people would be moving into it. And so the structure that you see there is the main structure of the St. Louis Art Museum today. Now, the vast majority of the other buildings were built as a temporary structure. They were made out of plaster or Paris in a combination of straw or hemp or something that would kind of bind with the plaster or Paris. It was meant to make it very durable, but not very sustainable for a long period of time. It was meant to be good for the fair, but that's about it. Anything after that, the building would be kind of deteriorated. As you look here, this is the Palace of Transportation. That building was very ornate. It has a lot of nice archways and such, but they could build it, make it look very, very fancy because it was temporary. The temporary material was much cheaper than the permanent structure. You go back here to the photograph of the art museum, it looks kind of boring, kind of bland, but this is a permanent structure. This permanent structure, even though it looks very bland, costs 3 times the amount of money to construct than the temporary structure of the Palace of Transportation. So a lot of people wish that the buildings from the fairgrounds were still there today, but if you would have done so, that would have made the cost to be so huge that it would be cost prohibitive to make them that way. And so this is the Palace of Transportation. In this building, you would have seen different kinds of modes of transportation that were historical as well as contemporary. So you can go in there to see train locomotives from the 1850s, as well as the more modern automobile that had just really been invented and was being showcased. You can also go into the Palace of Agriculture, and you can actually see things that were being displayed by local farmers and such. So this is what was called the section 107, group 107 for pomology. And this happens to be the Illinois section for that particular palace. And so these were all the people who were from Illinois who were exhibiting apples or pears or peaches and such like that. And so if you can read some of those names on there, they may look a little bit familiar to you. And we have here, and also from the Alton newspaper, the Honorable H.G. McPike was gathering together a new crop of grapes to be brought into St. Louis for the fair. And he hoped to be able to display them for the Illinois Pomological Exhibition and hope to have for some prizes as they put it into. So it took me a long time to figure out what pomology was, because last year someone asked me to do some research on some apples that were being exhibited from the state of Louisiana. And we had this nice book that describes all of the different exhibits, and I was looking on there for like different fruits and vegetables. I'm looking, there's nothing that was describing apples. Like there had to be some apples being displayed somewhere in this fair. And ultimately, I don't know how I did it, but I came across the section called pomology. I'm like, it's pomology. So I went to Google and said, pomology. It's the study of growing fruit. So I go to that section, there were all the apple winners, and I found the guy that I was looking for from Louisiana was listed there. I just got done looking for somebody from the state of Colorado who was doing the exact same kind of search for Colorado apples. And so I don't know where all the fruits and vegetables were exhibited at the fair. And this display stand that you see there is actually from the Missouri section of the apples and the fruit. But this is typically the way all of the fruit would be exhibited at the fair. So some of the state buildings that you would have gone into at the fair, these were additional buildings that were on the fairgrounds This one here is the Missouri building. And so if you went into the Missouri building, you would see things that were indicative of the state of Missouri. So there could have been some paintings from Missouri artists, there could have been some fruits and vegetables that were being displayed by farmers of the state. Or you can go in there, you can hear a speech given by a local politician of the state of Missouri, or just visit, just have different events celebrating the state of Missouri. One sad thing about the Missouri building is that it actually burned down 11 days before the fair was over with. It was struck by lightning and burned completely down to the ground. This happened just right before the fair was over with. Another sad story, 1905 World's Fair was held in Portland, Oregon, to commemorate the Lewis and Clark expedition. At that fair, the Missouri building also burned down. So I'm suggesting that Missouri do not have any more buildings that need other World's Fair. Now, if you were also interested, you could go to the Oklahoma Territory Pavilion. This was another building that you could go in that you would learn about the history of Oklahoma. Oklahoma was not yet a state. So this was kind of an opportunity for people to kind of find out more about this region of the country that they may not have been familiar with. Now, if you're interested, you can go to El Reno, Oklahoma today. You can actually go into that building and visit their Elks Lodge. That building was sold after the fair was over with. It was torn down, piece by piece, bit by bit, shipped on a railroad, gone to El Reno, Oklahoma, taken off the railroad, reconstructed in the city, and made it into their Elks Lodge. It's looking slightly different on the ground level, but if you look at it, you can definitely tell that is in fact the same building. Now, this here is on the left-hand side, is the Illinois State Building. If you look at the map, it is on the buildings that are right in here. This is the primary down here. And then Illinois building right over here, along with the Lincoln Museum building as well. So the picture there on the left is the building as it was constructed. The Lincoln Museum there is on the top right hand side. The bottom picture there is the dedication for the Lincoln, for the Illinois building. And in the back of that building is the Great Ferris Wheel, which I'll be talking about in 3 minutes. There was a special week dedicated for Illinois. It was October the 3rd through the 8th. This was a little bit of controversy, unfortunately. The week that was established as Illinois Week was established by the fair organizers themselves. It was not established by the Illinois government. From what I've been able to, the research I've been able to do on this is that Illinois, the week designated as Illinois Week was also the week that was the Illinois State Fair in the state. And so Illinois people were furious that St. Louis had picked the same week as the fair as to be as the Illinois State Fair to be as the same week as Illinois. It really upset the governor of Illinois at the time, and he in fact was calling for almost like a boycott of the fair, of the World's Fair itself, and telling people to go more to the Illinois State Fair instead. So if you actually came to visit the World's Fair for Illinois Week, you could have visited the Illinois exhibit in the House of Horticulture. That's their apple display right there. And also there is a recreated cabin of Abraham Lincoln that was being on display in the Lincoln Museum building. So there were things for Illinois people to see that was not just St. Louis things going on. So some of the foreign buildings that were there at the fairgrounds included the Japanese Pavilion. This was 7 different buildings on the fairgrounds that were there that kind of showed what Japanese culture was all about. Typically, if you came to the fair, you probably had never visited Japan or a lot of these other foreign countries. And so it was an opportunity for you to see what the culture and lifestyle was of those countries. And so they recreated their buildings to look much like the buildings of the country. And so the Japanese buildings were very much Japanese. The Austrian pavilion down there on the bottom very much was not an Austrian looking building. This was more of an Art Nouveau architecture style. And it was being laughed at by the other foreign countries because it didn't look very Austrian. But in its own right, it did win a special award from the fair organizers because it had some of the best art installations of any foreign building in its possession. And so it felt like it was vindicated for that reason. Another interesting building on the fairgrounds was the Swedish Pavilion. Here you can go into the Swedish Pavilion and learn all things Swedish. Now, this building had a little bit of a unique story compared to many of the other buildings. Most of the time, the foreign governments allotted a certain amount of money to have the buildings being constructed in St. Louis for the fair. So whether it was like $1 million, $2 million, whatever it was, they raised that money, came to St. Louis and constructed the building on the fairgrounds with that money. Sweden decided they did not want to fund any kind of building for the fairgrounds, so the money that was due, they could actually raise money on their own. There was a private company that put together some funding and raised the money. They constructed the building actually in Sweden. Like they wanted to look, this is more like a typical Swedish home at that time. They constructed it there in Sweden, took it apart piece by piece, bit by bit, shipped it across the ocean, brought it on a railroad car into St. Louis, brought it to the fairgrounds, reconstructed it on the fairgrounds to be reconstructed as it was built. Then, once the fair was over with, this building then was sold again to an organization, and it was shipped to Lindsborg, Kansas, and became part of Bethany College there in Lindsborg. Now, it turns out that in Lindsborg, Kansas, there were a large contingency of Swedish people that was living there. And so they actually were the kind of helping spearhead the effort to get the building to be brought to St. Louis in the first place. Then after the fair was over, they put together the funds to purchase the building and being shipped to Lindsborg, Kansas. And it's in Lindsborg, Kansas, because, as I said, Lindsborg has a large Swedish population that came to that area in the 1870s and established the town. If you go there today, that building was originally used as a hall on the college where they taught the language and arts classes, but it was in need such bad repair that they shipped it from the university, from the college campus, and they moved it into this place called Heritage Square, where it's like a recreated town village of old historic buildings and such. And you can go visit it today. And it's been secured with new foundations, new windows, and everything like that. And you're probably wondering, why is Jason talking so much about the Swedish Pavilion? Is Jason Swedish? No, Jason is not Swedish. But Jason actually visited the Swedish Pavilion 2 years ago. My wife and I were on vacation in 23 Kansas, and we were in Colorado, and we were coming back home, and we're needing a place to stay kind of halfway between Wilson Springs, Colorado, and St. Louis. And not being willing to travel 17 hours in one day, I was looking for a place kind of somewhere in the middle. And so I found a hotel in McPherson, Kansas, which is in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. But if you go anywhere in Kansas, everything's in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. No offense to anybody from Kansas. But so I'm thinking that in the back of my head, I did this presentation and I talked about Lindsborg, Kansas, the Swedish Pavilion. I wonder how far my hotel room is from here. So I go to the search engine, type in the Swedish Pavilion. Literally, it's 10 minutes away from the hotel. I'm thinking, there's no way that this could have been that close. I mean, it was 10 minutes away. I said, so I told my wife, we're making a road trip. We're taking a detour on the way home. We're going to visit the Swedish Pavilion. So we went there, we saw the museum. It is dedicated to Swedish history and the Swedish culture that is there in Lindsborg, Kansas. So if you're ever in the middle of nowhere in Lindsborg, Kansas, it's a wonderful museum to go visit. Now, one of the unfortunate things about the 1904 World's Fair is the whole fact that they put people on display. And this is what was going on at many of the World's Fairs at the time, where they were trying to show off how more advanced certain civilizations were, or how under advanced other civilizations were. And so at this time in 1904, the United States had just defeated Spain and acquired the Philippine Islands as its new territory. And so they thought that it would be a good idea to bring in some of the native peoples from the Philippine Islands into St. Louis to kind of show where civilization was at in that part of the world. So they brought in the Igorot tribe, and what they forced them to do was to force them out of the places that they were living there in the Philippines, brought them to St. Louis, had them recreate their village so that people could come and watch them do normal day-to-day things. And so one of the unfortunate things with the Igorot people is that they use dog as one of their main sources of food consumption. And so I've heard stories where the Igorot people would escape out of the village at nighttime, go into the local community, steal dogs, and would use them for their food. I've also heard stories where the fair organizers would provide them with the dogs themselves and let them use that as a food source. I can't say for sure which one is actually correct, or maybe both, I can't say, but that's how the Igorot people have become known to the fair. And it's just one of those unfortunate things where society, certain people's society would think that they were more advanced than others, that they could bring people on display. And this also included Geronimo. He had just been captured and brought into the fair as a Native American. And also this is a drawing of an Igorot man by the name of Antonio. He did these, Antonio drew this self-portrait of himself, and Geronimo gave an autograph to a young girl by the name of Adele Twinite Phelps. Adele visited the fair in 1904 as a young girl, but later on as a high school student, she puts together her recollections of the fair. And so she puts together these descriptions of her visits to the fair that included these mementos that she received while visiting the fair. Now, the other thing that you could go to at the fair was known as the pipe. As I was mentioning earlier, this is kind of like the amusement park aspect of the fair. It was kind of not really the whole, it wasn't really accepted by the fair organizers because this was not the educational aspect of the fair. The palaces that you could go into, those places were more sophisticated, more where you could have emotion stuff. The pipe was not of the same capacity, but they determined that if they had these opportunities, people to go visit, then it would boost attendance and it would boost kind of the revenue for the fair. And so you can go on here and you can go visit different places. Creation was a place that you could go to find take a boat ride and look at what creation was like from a biblical standpoint of view. Baby incubators was not yet medical science, it was more medical factory, if you want to say it that way. They didn't really believe that baby incubators were capable of being able to save baby's life if necessary. And so they resorted baby incubators to be a separate building on the pipe where people paid admission to go actually see babies being cared for by nurses. And this is what's been going on in the photograph there. And educated horse by the name of Jim Key was also on the pipe. He had a very special building dedicated in his honor. Jim Key was a horse that was supposedly trained to do math problems and word problems. You can give him a problem, he can take his nose, he can point to the answer on a tablet. I'm assuming it was all good because it was one of the big attractions on the fair itself. The Tyrolling Alps was a German themed place that you go to. They had a restaurant that could seat up to 5,000 people at a time. This was all things German culture, all things German cuisine type of thing. And take a small little railroad and visit a German village, if you would want to call it that. It was a restaurant that had German food and German beverages available. This is a sample of some of the items on the menu. Under cold dishes at the very top, you see some beef tongue available for 75 cents. You go down to under sandwiches, there was also beef tongue available. And their beef tongue is only 30 cents. So I'm not sure if I want my beef tongue to be hot, which would be cold, but either way, I probably wouldn't be eating beef tongue if I was there. There wouldn't be a good German restaurant if it didn't have good German beer, and St. Louis was home to many good German breweries. Anheuser-Busch, Falstaff, Lift, and Columbia breweries were among the ones that were selling their beer at that restaurant. If German culture and German cuisine was not your fancy, you could scroll down to a little bit further down on the pipe, and you could go into Fair Japan, where you could buy all things Japanese. You could go in there, you could buy kimonos and hats and clothing of all sorts of things, all sorts of things that were German, Japanese culture. You also had a restaurant in there as well, and this restaurant was interesting because it really didn't have much Japanese food on it. The only Japanese food is there on the very right hand side of the very corner, bottom corner, and that shows your traditional Japanese dishes. Some of the other items that were on there were like fish and omelets and sandwiches and stuff, which would be more of your American type of food. One of the big attractions on the fair itself was called the observation wheel. This was also what we commonly refer to as the Ferris wheel today. The Ferris wheel was introduced in 1893 at the Chicago Fair, but they were able to bring it to St. Louis and construct it there. What is really interesting about this Ferris wheel, if you look at the numbers, 265 feet tall, 2,160 people could ride the Ferris wheel at one time. The weight amazing, 4,200 tons, and the axle itself weighs 70 tons. And if you were so inclined to get married on the Ferris wheel, it was an option available to you. Once the Ferris wheel was open, it was a big novel thing that people were anxious to be on. And so many people were so anxious to ride the Ferris wheel to get married, they actually designated car number 19 to be the wedding car. You get on the Ferris wheel, and one ticket would take you all the way around twice. That's about 30 minutes per time to go around. So that was more than enough opportunity for you to get married on the Ferris wheel. So there are stories of people getting on the Ferris wheel. The bride was on a horse and the groom was on a donkey. There were times where there were like little organs that were used to play the music during the ceremony. So it was very elaborate. Now, one car could hold up to 60 people at a time. And one railroad car that we know of today was the size of the car on the Ferris wheel itself. So if you think of how big a railroad car is, that's how big the Ferris wheel car is. So that's why you get 60 people on there at a time. That's why you can get married on there and all that. This was very good. Well, let me back up here just one second. Now there had been some speculation that once the fair was over, that they buried the axle of the Ferris wheel in the Forest Park. That rumor has been debunked by some of the members of the World's Fair Society in St. Louis. They were able to determine through some of the research that they've been doing that once the fair was over with, they had shipped the Ferris wheel back to Chicago with the intent to hope to find someone to buy it and to reconstruct it at a amusement park or another World Fair. Unfortunately, with it being the size that it was and the capacity that it was, that nobody wanted to bring it into their local community and have it. So ultimately in the 19 teens, it was dynamited for Stratman. Unfortunately, yeah. Now, if you went to the top of the Ferris wheel, this was probably an opportunity for you to see things at a height that you've never seen before. This was a time before airplanes. This was a time before multi-level story buildings. And so going up on a Ferris wheel 200 feet up in the air was a big deal. And so many times people would go on the Ferris wheel multiple times in a day's time, just an opportunity to be able to see things that were going on. And this is a quote that says, "The view from the top of the wheel was very fine. We made 2 trips in the afternoon and in the evening 2 more to see the illumination, which looked fine." So at nighttime, all the buildings were lit up with electricity, which also was a new thing in 1904. So riding the Ferris wheel at night, to see all the lights, was a double pleasure for some of these people. The 1904 Olympic Games was also held in St. Louis at the time of the World's Fair. Sadly, St. Louis was able to steal the Olympics from Chicago. Originally, the Chicago had secured the rights to the Olympic Games, but the World Fair organizers in St. Louis were talking to the Olympic organizers and saying, "Hey, you know everybody's going to be in St. Louis for the fair, right? Why would you want to have the Olympics in Chicago? No one wants to go to Chicago for the fair, for the Olympic Games. You need to bring in the St. Louis." So whether it was a form of rivalry or strong coercion or something, they were able to convince the Olympic organizers to move the games to St. Louis. And so St. Louis was the first American city to host the Olympic Games. Now, the Olympic Games in St. Louis at the time of the fair were much different than the Olympic Games that we know of today. Today, we think of the Olympics as being more of an international competition. In 1904, over 90% of the people who were competing in these games were from the United States. It was almost impossible for a foreign athlete to travel, say, from Paris or from Australia or some of these foreign countries to come to St. Louis for the fair. And to be part of the Olympics. And so you had things like the Chicago Athletic Club competing against the Milwaukee Athletic Club, or the St. Louis Rowing Club competing against the New York Rowing Club in these competitions. And so there are almost 800 athletes involved with the Olympics, and close to 95% of them are from the United States. George Poe, the gentleman here on the right-hand side, is the first African American to win an Olympic medal. He comes from Wisconsin to St. Louis to compete in the Olympics. He wins 2 medals. He actually stays in St. Louis for a number of years and teaches high school at a local high school there in St. Louis. Thomas Hicks on the top right-hand side is the cheater of the Olympic marathon, I mean, the winner of the Olympic marathon. It was declared the winner of the marathon, but he needed to, in order to win the marathon, he needed to cheat. There are stories of him riding on the back of a pickup truck part of the way. There are also stories of him injecting or drinking a combination of strychnine, brandy, and egg whites to help him numb his pain so that he could actually run better. And as you can see there, he's getting some help there in that photograph as well. The bottom picture on the right-hand side is another one of those unfortunate aspects of the World Series, the Olympic Games. It was called the Anthropological Days. These were competitions that were set up to be held between many of the Native American tribes on the fair that were being brought into the fair. Fair organizers and Olympic organizers thought it was a good idea to have these different competitions for the Native peoples to take part in. In this competition here, you see a gentleman on the very left-hand side of the photograph who was shooting a bow and arrow. This was a competition that he was taking part in, was the bow and arrow shoot. Unfortunately, this is the very first time he's ever been known to shoot a bow and arrow in his life. And so they were forcing these people to take part in competitions when they had no prior skill or interest in these things. And so they thought by being a Native American, indicated that all Native American people would shoot bow and arrows and that they had skill in this. And unfortunately, many of them did not. So they were taking part in competitions that they really were unqualified to do. Another aspect of the fair that I would like to debunk for you right now is on the famous foods that were invented at the fair. The first section is a list of foods that many people associated with being invented at the fair, but unfortunately the term that we use at the Historical Society is popularized. Ice cream cone, iced tea, hot dog, hamburger, all things that many people associated with being invented at the fair were not invented at the fair. These are things that were already being sold or being utilized in some capacity in some other place across the country. The only 2 things that we can confirm that were introduced for the very first time at the fair was puffed rice and prairie floss. I'm sure everybody in this room and on Zoom has had puffed rice before, right? Everybody said Rice Krispies, right? Okay, that's what puffed rice is Rice Krispies. And everybody said prairie floss, right? Cotton candy.
Oh,
And the gentleman who invented cotton candy for the fair was what kind of occupation?
Dentist.
He was a dentist, very good. And I always tell people that he created cotton candy to make more business for himself. But I could be wrong, but it's a good theory that I'm going with until someone tells me otherwise. Get back up for just 1 second. The photograph that we see on this picture on the slide here, this is the only known photograph that we have of anybody at the fair actually eating an ice cream cone. For many, many years, this photograph was unidentified in our collection. One of my colleagues some years ago came across the photograph and we labeled them as the Cone Kids. If anybody's familiar with Saturday Night Live in the late 70s,
Coneheads. Yeah.
okay, I'm almost that old, so I do remember them.
I do.
Okay, so we were referring to them as the Cone Kids. Not too long after we put together this exhibit that we had for the fair, and we had this photograph in the exhibit, we were able to identify who this family was. So this actually, one of the 2 young boys in this photograph was a fairly prominent lawyer in St. Louis for many years. So we do know who it's the Montague family. I'm not sure exactly which of the two sons it was, but one of them was a prominent lawyer. A couple of tidbits of information to share with you. The Liberty Bell came to St. Louis by train to be displayed at the Pennsylvania Building during the summer and fall of the World's Fair. First time the Liberty Bell had ever left Philadelphia. The Palace of Agriculture had a walnut elephant statue, a concord statue, a pruned bear statue, and several different butter statues, if you were so inclined. Festival Hall had a dome that was larger than St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican, and also had the largest pipe organ in the world with over 10,000 pipes to it. And it also had an auditorium that would seat 3,500 people at one time. And the final bit of information, the Wolfsburg Pavilion that is in St. Louis at Forest Park, and also the Jefferson Memorial Building was actually built after the fair was over with, the proceeds and the profits that were made from the fair. Many people think that both of those buildings have a direct connection to the fair. They do, in fact, they do, but they have post-fair, so they were built with the money made from the fair itself. And finally, I'll leave you with this quote from Stratman. It says, "Never to expect to see anything so grand again." The World's Fair was a big thing in St. Louis. It still has a lot of people with a lot of different memories and a lot of fond memories of the fair. So it's probably the event that has the most amount of research being done about it. And it's ever present in St. Louis history. This was a photograph from the final night of the fair. It says farewell and good night. And in the middle there is actually a silhouette of David R. Francis's dead. So if you look at it and you know what David R. Francis looks like, that definitely is him in a weird kind of way. If you are interested in learning more about the fair, the Library Research Center where I work at has an extensive collection of materials about the fair. And so we are able to help answer a lot of great questions about the fair. You can visit us in person or call us or email us. I do have my card over there on the table. If you are interested in learning more about visiting, there's also some brochures from the museum and from the library as well. We have a new exhibit that just opened up last year about the fair. This is a permanent exhibit for the fair. It will be there indefinitely. There will be some things that will change out through the years, but this exhibit is going nowhere fast. So you have plenty of time to come see it. In the middle of the exhibit is a large 3D model of what the fairgrounds look like. So we take that map that we looked at tonight and we recreate it into a 3D model where you can actually see how big some of these buildings were on the fairgrounds. And to go a little bit further detail, we also have a new book that was published on the fair, The Wonder and Complexity of the 1904 World Fair. This was just published this past fall, and it has a lot of good information about some of the topics that I mentioned tonight and some of the other ones as well. But it's more of a, it's not meant to be like a academic type of reading, it's more of a leisure type of reading. So it examines the fair in more of the modern day interpretations. So I move with that, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. They happen to some degree because they are much like Olympic Games where they take so much planning and so much money to put them on that it's really difficult for cities to want to host them. Osaka, Japan, where the fair is at this year, has had several in the past, and so it's kind of going back to the same place that it was before. I believe in the early 2000s they had one there as well, and like 1990s, I believe as well. So they are, but they are much smaller than they were in 1904 or the other ones. They're just not as, I guess, necessary as they used to be. Meaning the fair, like in 1904, is really just kind of show off the big technology of the day, the big things that were going on at that time, and people were not so familiar with what an automobile looked like, or what a train may have looked like, or they never maybe visited Japan before, they had never experienced Japanese culture. So this was an opportunity that happened. Same with international travel being so much, and the way the world is, that they're just, the need is not for anything.
You got it.
Exactly, yeah, and I mean, the last one that was in the United States was in 1982 in Knoxville, Tennessee.
This
Did
is
that-
Columbus, Ohio, 1982. Chicago, 1982 also.
And some of those may or may not have been actual, they may have planned them to be World's Fairs, but some of them never actually occurred. And I don't think the one in Chicago in 92. I'm not sure. That's the first one I've actually heard of that one. So.
Did the St. Louisans that
Canceled.
Yeah.
You're right.
they take great pride in their accomplishment relative to the Chicago effort after the,
I would imagine.
do they have a sense of esteem about it? Or do they feel like, oh, we did our best?
Well, I mean, if you talk to anybody in St. Louis, I mean, most of them, I mean, it's like,
A regional,
it's like a
The
little,
best years of
well, it's
St.
not a
Louis.
cap, so to speak, where it's like, you know, it's like the crowning glory of St. Louis history. You know, it's like one of the things that most people familiarize themselves. It's like Cardinals, beer, Baltimore. And that was the whole idea, is that they wanted to be bigger and better than Chicago. So
you said it was the fourth largest city, was that Chicago,
and
New York, Baltimore, not Baltimore, Boston, Philadelphia?
Let me get my notes. You have it written down. I will get it wrong. Number one, New York, 3.4 million people. Number two, Chicago, 1.7 million. Number three, Philadelphia, 1.3 million. And number four, St. Louis.
I have a question. So for the people coming from abroad and also other parts of the country, how are they getting into St. Louis?
Once they got to America, the railroads were probably the most convenient way of getting to St. Louis. I would imagine some sort of international ship.
What would be the main port for like Japan or would they be coming to the East Coast or would they be coming to the South?
I would say maybe New Orleans up the river would be one way, New York. Coming in the St. Louis by railroad that way. That's maybe it's coming in from California too. Yeah, so I would imagine all those, I mean, St. Louis had a lot of different options getting in and out of the city at that time. Railroads were very prevalent. River traffic probably was in some capacity as well.
I heard or read somewhere that St. Louis wanted the 1893 World's Fair, and they were kind of bent out of shape. They didn't get it.
Yeah. That is true, yeah, they've all stopped Chicago from that, both terms, so. That was the reason why they were trying to be bigger and better than Chicago, so.
How is the fair financed?
It did receive some federal government money. I don't know the exact number right offhand, but it received money from that. And then also a lot of the St. Louis business people were also donating to it as well. There's a large group of St. Louis businessmen who were kind of like underwriting it, so to speak. They're providing funding for it. Then the money that they were using, that like admission tickets and such, helped pay for all of this stuff as well. And like, if I went into the band building, I had to pay a 25-cent admission fee or whatever it was. A big portion of that money then came back to the fair organization. And so that's why they were able to make so much profit from the fair itself, is because you couldn't just have your own concession stand and make your own money. You had to, if you had a concession stand, that's what these different buildings were known as, concession stands, even though they may have been a restaurant, or they may have been a music hall, or whatever it may be, it was still considered a concession stand. And so these concession stands, the profits they had to turn back over some of it to the fair organizers. So, but there's a wide range of ways that money was coming in for. And then also, a lot of those government buildings four buildings were being financed by the government, other countries as well.
You said that it opened on April 30th,
Mhm.
1940. Did it last a full year?
December 1st was the last year, yeah, so 7 months and 2 days. And what's interesting about this is that 19.7 million people that we were talking about was just for 6 days. It actually was closed on Sundays. My guess is that it was closed because of religious purposes. I have not yet found anything that definitively says it's going to be closed on Sunday to observe religious practices, but I would love to be able to find that out.
I grew up in the South and there were called blue laws that you couldn't have
Yeah,
business.
Yeah.
that could very well really be the case. I'm hoping to find that. Still is not against something that was definitively. I'm assuming that is the case, but still looking at it.
How much of the artifacts are still in existence from the fair?
A lot of, like artifacts you like is in.
Well, like in Grafton, the Aruba Hotel. The bar in the Aruba Hotel came from the World's Fair.
Right, and there are buildings all over the country that are from the fair. There are a lot of buildings in the San Luis region, and then there are pieces that are from the fair. I gave this presentation not that long ago, and a gentleman who lives in the University of Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, there, right outside of the fairgrounds, said that his driveway for his house, when he was growing up, was made out of the fence, the metal pickets of the fence that were used as this security fence. They were bought after the fair was over with, and then brought to their house in University City and lined the driveway of that house. And so when the fair was over with, there was a company called Chicago Wrecking Crew Company in Chicago that was responsible for tearing everything down. And a lot of these things that were being torn down were then being repurposed and resold to different orgs. So the bar here and also they probably would have maybe have bought it from one of the buildings and then repurposed it here. That pipe organ that was in the festival hall was actually then shipped after the fair was shipped to Philadelphia and was in the Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia. There are parts of different buildings that were statues that were sold, and they are now part of a new building someplace else in New York. There is a wonderful book called Still Shining that examines all of these buildings that are still in existence, or different parts of different buildings that were repurposed for the fair, from the fair as in new places today. There were buildings that were like the Brazil building was actually shipped back to Rio de Janeiro and was used as a government building in Rio de Janeiro for many years. But when Rio de Janeiro decided to put in a subway system in the 50s and 60s, that building was torn down for that purpose. Because it was in the way of where the subway was going. And so we find these stories all over the time, tidbits of pieces of buildings that were being repurposed from the fair in some capacity. Some of them are private homes in St. Louis today. The Wisconsin building is a private home in Kirkland, Missouri. There was a radiator building in the Palace of Manufacturers, which was showing off how new fancy radiators were used in homes. That was taken out of that building and then made into a private home in Butcher Groves. And so these are stories that we hear all the time that remnants of the fair still exist.
Just on geography, is the modern day Forest Park equivalent to the fairgrounds where the World's Fair was, or do they just intersect in some way?
Forest Park had been established in 1876, and it was still kind of like an open land type thing. So they acquired the western part of Forest Park to be part of the fair, and then the Washington University campus in the Mud neighborhood outside of Forest Park there was also part. So Forest Park itself is about the same equivalent size as the World Fair, but it doesn't. But it was all within Forest Park. It was the western edge and then outside the park as well, so. But yeah, it's. The cost of land of the fair is about the same cost of the fairground, but it's not the same amount of land. Yeah, thank you. If you are interested in more about the fair, I do have my card over there, so if you want to send me an email or give me a call, I'd be happy to do some additional research for you, or if any other questions about St. Louis or Missouri history or whatever it may be, I'd be happy to help out.
We're serving some ice cream that was made popular by the girls.
Right.
More popular.
Thank you.
I get to.
That's